Julie Andrews, the voice that defined an era of film. The woman who made the world believe that magic was real through Mary Poppins and turned the sound of music into a prayer echoing across generations, is more than a legend. She was the voice that compelled fear itself to fall silent. Born in wartime London, where ceilings trembled and stability was an illusion, she forged a voice so crystalline it seemed heaven-sent, disciplined with a precision so exact it bordered on merciless, nearly untouchable in its purity. Hollywood placed a crown upon her head. Audiences rose in reverence. For decades, that voice was not merely admired, it was trusted. Yet behind the smile that defined a generation lay a truth never sung aloud. A childhood shattered within the very walls meant to protect her, and a fateful surgery that permanently stole the voice that had once been the heart of the world. And today, at 90, that fire still burns in her eyes. Yet deep within lies a question that has never been laid to rest. When the voice that once saved the world no longer belongs to you, what remains to keep you standing? If Julie Andrews has ever been the sound of your memories, leave a tribute for the woman who turned silence into strength when no song could carry her anymore. It is hard to believe that the voice that would one day soothe millions was forged in shuttered rooms where no applause could reach, in darkness that taught her vigilance long before it ever taught her confidence. Julie Andrews, born Julia Elizabeth Wells, on October 1st, 1935, entering a world already destabilized by war and by fractures inside her own family. For 14 years, she believed Edward Charles Wells, the gentle school teacher she called Dad, was her father. In his quiet steadiness, she located something that felt like protection. It was not dramatic, not loud, simply reliable. Then in 1950, at 14, that foundation was removed in a single conversation. Her mother, Barbara, told her Edward was not her biological father, that she was the child of a fleeting, ill-fated romance. The revelation did not detonate. It hollowed. Identity recalibrated overnight. Memories tilted under re-examination. Even the word home thinned at the edges. Years later, she would recall it without spectacle, only restraint, saying quietly, "It changes how you stand in the world when the ground you trusted moves." It was not just a secret uncovered. It was a hairline fracture that would later determine how carefully, how deliberately, she placed her weight in the world. But the stage lights had not yet reached her when the war had already stripped away the illusion of shelter. Before any truth about her birth emerged, the war itself had been rewriting her childhood in smoke and rubble. London trembled under bombardment, ceilings shook, glass fractured, ration lines lengthened. Scarcity was not an episode. It was atmosphere. Her parents' marriage thinned under pressure and finally gave way, and Julie was sent to live with her mother and her new husband, Ted Andrews, a vaudeville performer whose applause belonged to the theater and never quite followed him home. Post-war poverty did not relent. Coal was rationed. Plates were modest. Stability was negotiated daily. Barbara, burdened and increasingly numbed by drink, faded in and out of reliability, present in body, yet distant in steadiness. Ted noticed the brilliance in Julie's voice early, but recognition did not equate to protection. Admiration is not the same as safety. When alcohol altered him, boundaries shifted into territory no child should be required to understand. Years later, Julie would acknowledge there were incidents. Only twice, she would say carefully. Yet repetition is not the measure of impact. 2 moments were enough to recalibrate a nervous system. From then forward, each night concluded the same way. The quiet turn of a lock. Not ritual. Precaution. She lay still in the dark, mapping the house by sound, the settling of floorboards, the tremor of hinges, learning that vigilance could be trained like balance. She did not dramatize those memories in adulthood, she reduced them to fact. But reduction is its own form of endurance. Restraint becomes habit when expression no longer feels safe. However, inside that uncertainty, something stood unbreakable. Her voice did not surface as decoration, it rose as a lifeline, clear, precise, unshaken at its core. It was never a pretty talent meant for display, but an instrument of survival. When she sang, sound followed laws, even when the adults around her did not. Harmony obeyed discipline where home offered none. Rhythm replaced chaos. Breath could be counted. Control could be held. The contradiction cut deep. Ted Andrews, whose mercurial presence darkened her nights, was also the one who steered her toward the stage, urging her into the glare of footlights where applause could briefly smother what she could not yet name. The same man who unsettled her private world opened the door to the public one that would define her destiny. There is a severe symmetry in that path, turmoil guiding her toward command. Her ascent did not begin with triumph. It began with a refusal to splinter. Every note carried more than melody. It carried alignment. Every performance tightened an inner vow she never spoke aloud. If the sound stays steady, I stay steady. One day, audiences would praise the composure, the polish, the serenity. Few would measure how young she was when those qualities were forged, or understand that brilliance is often the hardened surface of something shaped in the dark. Long before she could name what safety was, she learned how to project beyond its absence. A single note could outrun fear, and that discovery changed everything. The voice did not bloom. It broke through, rising from somewhere beneath speech itself, fierce and unwavering, strong enough to keep a small girl upright in a house where silence meant caution and alertness was instinct. In the late 1940s, while other children disappeared into careless laughter, Julie Andrews was studying permanence. She understood early that protection did not reside in walls or in people. It existed in vibration. The sound that emerged from her was not charming. It was exact. It did not plead. It asserted. There was clarity in it that startled grown musicians, a steadiness that seemed older than the body carrying it. Ted Andrews, conflicted, complicated, flawed, was the first to recognize the magnitude. He saw not innocence, but force. And so performance entered her life before comfort ever did. Schedules replaced spontaneity. Repetition replaced rest. The very sound that steadied her also imposed expectation. Years later, she would reflect with the restraint of someone who had survived her own memory. Music arrived before explanation did. It steadied me before I understood why I needed steadying. Singing was not refuge. It was jurisdiction, the only place no one could trespass. There was no pause between childhood and discipline. At 13, she entered the discipline of the Cohn-Ripman School, now Tring Park School for the Performing Arts, where talent was not coddled, but compressed into strength. Yet the true forging came under Madame Lillian Stiles Allen, the revered soprano, whose standards left no room for fragility and whose belief did not tremble. Julie would later describe her as the first adult who asked for my strength without taking something from me, and even in memory, the sentence carried weight. In rooms lit by trembling gaslight, scales were repeated until hesitation vanished. Breath hung white in the air. Fingers stiffened against cold keys and colder mornings. The amateur works until he succeeds. The professional works until he cannot fail, Stiles Allen insisted, and Julie absorbed it like oxygen. At 11, she traveled alone between London and Leeds, a sandwich folded into her coat because there was no excess to spare. Other children returned home at dusk. She returned to repetition. She once laughed that her voice was sharp enough to gather every stray dog on the pavement, but humor hid vigilance. Critics later called her mechanical. They mistook composure for emptiness. Control was not affectation. It was survival architecture. It kept her intact. And sometimes, after practice, when her throat burned raw and no one was watching, she would press her hand against her chest to feel the vibration and think, if this disappears, what remains? In 1947, at 12, she stepped onto the London Hippodrome stage in Starlight Roof and delivered Je suis Titania from Mignon with authority that unsettled the air itself. The sound did not expand cautiously. It cut clean through space. Seasoned musicians understood at once this was not mimicry, it was command. A year later, beneath the chandeliers of the London Palladium at the Royal Command Variety performance, she sang before King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, the youngest soloist ever to claim that stage. Ceremony surrounded her, but habit grounded her. Inhale, align, release. These were not beginnings, they were thresholds that do not reopen. Through pantomimes, musicals, and BBC broadcasts, she continued with the precision of someone aware that stability can vanish without warning. Every entrance required certainty. Every phrase required discipline. The public witnessed assent. What remained unseen was the structure beneath it. Vigilance refined into poise, repetition hardened into resilience. A girl who once secured her bedroom door now standing unshielded beneath full light, building permanence from vibration. Applause dissolved at the curtain. What followed her home was expectation. And once expectation attaches itself to your name, there is no gentler version of yourself left to retreat into. Only the next note, and the conviction that it must not fail. Her ascent was not gilded. It was etched step by step through closed doors, restrained smiles, polite refusals, relentless rehearsals, and the weary vigilance of someone who knows that a single misstep could return her to the shadows of obscurity. In 1954, at only 19, she packed away all the familiarity of England and crossed the Atlantic with nothing but courage stitched to still raw talent, stepping onto the Broadway stage in The Boyfriend, aware that anonymity hovered above her like a silent verdict. That night, critics did more than applaud. They leaned forward, startled by the crystalline clarity of her soprano and the warmth that seemed to reach even the farthest balcony, a composure so steady it felt almost defiant, earning her the Theatre World Award and marking her not as a fleeting sensation, but as inevitability. Yet even as flowers filled her arms, she understood that applause is a loan, not a promise. It can be withdrawn without warning, and she never forgot that. Then My Fair Lady arrived in 1956, not as a gift, but as a furnace. Broadway fixed her with a scalpel-cold stare. Could a young, newly risen actress from England drag Eliza Doolittle from blackened soot to velvet silk and make her live down to the marrow? Julie answered by erasing herself from the glare and hurling her whole being into the work. Night after night, she flayed the role to the bone and rebuilt it with iron breath and a spine that would not bend until the production roared past 2,700 performances. Eliza was no longer a part. She was marrow, muscle, heartbeat. Then the blade fell. The film moved forward, and the role she had carried in her body for years was handed to Audrey Hepburn. No spectacle, no public shattering, only a suffocating pressure beneath the ribs that would not release. Years later, she said almost coolly, "It felt as if something I had grown inside myself was handed away without me." The wound was not theatrical. It was surgical. She had poured in youth, stamina, devotion, and learned that effort does not secure ownership. For one perilous suspended instant, her faith in fairness fractured. But fate did not slam the door. It wrenched the current in a direction she had not yet discerned. Walt Disney had seen how she could command a stage without noise, that quiet, incontrovertible authority, and he understood precisely the worth that had been overlooked. So he waited. He slowed the entire machinery of production. In 1962, when Julie stepped away from the lights to give birth to her daughter Emma and recover in the wake of motherhood, he kept the project for her. No replacement, no pressure. He waited until she was ready. And when Julie finally said yes to Mary Poppins, the equilibrium began to shift. The film did not merely succeed, it surged across the world like a long overdue correction of justice. Her performance, exact to each breath, buoyant yet under absolute control, tender yet unshakably firm, carried the resonance of every silence she had ever swallowed. And when her name was called for the Academy Award for Best Actress, surpassing Audrey Hepburn, it was not revenge. It was the restoration of order. She did not enter Hollywood by bending herself to fit its shape. She arrived whole, and it was Hollywood that had to recalibrate to be worthy of her. She did not linger in triumph. In 1965, at 29, she became Maria von Trapp in The Sound of Music, unaware the Austrian hills would seal her into generations. Audiences remember the radiant spin beneath open sky. They do not remember the helicopter downdrafts that struck like blunt force, the endless takes that left her drenched, shivering, skin welted by wind. She did not complain. Endurance had hardened into reflex. The film would break records and claim 5 Academy Awards, but she met the surge without intoxication. She saved carefully, invested quietly, bought a London home, and later a modest refuge in California, building permanence instead of spectacle. Beside her stood Blake Edwards, not as ornament, but as witness, their marriage tempered in illness and depression, resilience proven in private rather than on marquees. And beneath ovations and box office thunder, she still carried the memory of a frightened child once turning a bedroom lock for safety, a small, unextinguished fear fused into the steel of her composure. You discover quite young that steadiness is something you must build within, she would say. Each sustained note was not display but reclamation. Critics named her voice angelic. She knew it as instrument, compass, shelter. In the blaze of the 1960s, she stood not glittering, but tempered. Having survived erasure without collapse, acclaim without excess, and disappointment without surrendering grace. Her legacy endures not because it dazzled, but because it was forged where no one was clapping. For decades, the world did not simply see Julie Andrews. It believed she was a miracle walking in real life. Applause followed her wherever she went, awards crowned her name, and that luminous soprano seemed untouchable, an inheritance from heaven itself. Yet while the world celebrated the dream, something fragile and human was quietly unfolding behind the curtain. In the mid-1990s, while commanding the stage in Victor/Victoria, she began to notice a faint roughness in her throat, a whisper of strain that refused to disappear. She brushed it aside, telling herself it was merely the wear of years spent filling theaters and concert halls with a voice that had once seemed to defy gravity and time. How could she suspect that this small tremor would open the deepest wound of her life? For Julie, hailed as Hollywood's golden voice, the radiant spirit who floated through Mary Poppins in 1964 and stood atop cinematic hills as Maria von Trapp in 1965, the woman critics said could summon angels with a single sustained note. Such a threat felt impossible. Her voice was never just a gift, it was her compass through wartime childhood, through poverty, through every trembling audition and every standing ovation. And in 1997, At 62, standing at a pinnacle of glory that felt invincible, she entered the operating room believing she was protecting the very essence of herself, only to awaken into a silence sharp as steel, as if a blade had cut straight through her destiny, leaving a wound no promise, no prayer, no power could ever heal. What followed was not merely a medical complication, but a shattering of identity. Doctors had assured her the nodules on her vocal cords were benign, nothing life-threatening, nothing to fear. The procedure, they said, was routine. Trusting their confidence, she surrendered to anesthesia with quiet faith, recalling perhaps the little girl who once sang to escape the thunder of war, never imagining that silence would become her new companion. When she opened her eyes after surgery, there was no searing pain, only an absence. She tried to speak, to test the familiar resonance that had carried her through decades of artistry. Instead, a hoarse rasp emerged, foreign and fragile. The soaring clarity that had once lifted audiences to their feet would not return. Scar tissue had stiffened the delicate chords that once vibrated like living silk. In a single night, the instrument that had defined her was altered beyond recognition. She later described it as a death inside, as though a light kindled in childhood had been quietly extinguished. She did not rage in public. She did not accuse the heavens. She simply faced a mirror and met a version of herself she did not yet understand. 4 additional surgeries followed, each one a fragile thread of hope. She traveled across the country to consult renowned specialists, clinging to the possibility that even a fragment of her former sound might be restored. Each effort ended the same way. Even conversation became an exertion. Every sentence a reminder of what had slipped beyond reach. In public, she carried herself with poise, offering warmth and grace. In private, she wept into nights stripped of melody. Blake Edwards, her husband of more than 30 years, would say in 1998, what she feared most had come true. She would never sing again. He held her through the quiet, but love could not recreate vibration in wounded chords. Sleep became elusive. The ovations of memory echoed like distant thunder, beautiful yet unreachable. Therapy offered structure but not solace. Hope thinned, yet she remained standing. The wound was no longer in her throat, it was in her trust. By 2000, when she realized the confidence she had placed there had not been fully safeguarded, she filed a malpractice lawsuit against Mount Sinai Hospital and the surgeons who had promised safety. The claim alleged she had not been completely informed of the risks. The matter was settled privately for an undisclosed sum, but no settlement could restore resonance to silence. No figure could measure what had once carried her through hardship and triumph alike. And yet, she did not retreat into bitterness. She turned toward creation in a new form. With her daughter, Emma Walton Hamilton, she began writing. More than 30 children's books infused with wonder, tenderness, and quiet strength. Stories for young hearts she could no longer serenade but still longed to reach. She lent her transformed voice to narration and animation, becoming Queen Lillian in the Shrek films and appearing in Despicable Me, proving that artistry adapts even when altered. More profoundly, she directed her energy toward funding research into vocal cord restoration, determined that others might be spared the path she had walked. Years later, when asked what absence she felt most keenly, she answered softly, "I don't miss performing, I miss singing. It's the purest expression of who I am." In that confession lay neither self-pity nor grand declaration, only truth. The world once revered her for the brilliance of her notes. In the hush that followed, it came to revere her resilience. Though the highest tones may never again ring as they once did, the courage with which she endured has become its own enduring music, echoing far beyond any stage. The loss of her voice was not the first time something she loved had slipped beyond her reach. Another fracture had arrived years earlier, not sudden, not violent, but slow enough to be mistaken for weather. She met Tony Walton in London at 13, 15, two young artists who did not fall in love in cafes or corridors, but under the hum of stage lights. While other teenagers rehearsed small rebellions, they rehearsed lines, drafted scenery, whispered about futures painted in velvet curtains and rising applause. They were not escaping ordinary life. They were building something larger than it. Their devotion matured without spectacle. Ambition did not divide them. It braided them together. Julie's voice gathered momentum across the West End and Broadway. Tony's sets transformed blank stages into living worlds. They believed, earnestly, almost stubbornly, that art would not compete with love, only amplify it. In 1959, at 24, she married him with the kind of certainty reserved for things one assumes permanent. 3 years later, in 1962, Emma was born. When she held her daughter for the first time, she would later recall quietly, "It felt like the future had finally settled into my arms." The house filled with scripts, sketches, lullabies. Photographs from that era caught something real, not performance, not image, but warmth. Tony leaning in, Julie radiant, Emma asleep between them. For a moment, success and intimacy moved in rhythm. They believed they had solved the equation. Then success accelerated. As her career carried her from London to Broadway to Hollywood, time stopped behaving like something they owned. Rehearsals bled into premieres. Filming replaced evenings. Airports replaced kitchens. Departure boards marked not destinations, but absence. There were nights Emma was already asleep when Julie returned. Mornings when she kissed a warm forehead and stepped back into waiting cars before the sun had fully risen. Tony's career flourished too, but on a different clock, one that did not align with hers. At first, they adapted. Then they justified. Then they endured. What neither expected was not ambition itself, but the quiet arithmetic of it. Distance did not explode, it compounded. Conversations shortened. Eye contact lingered longer, as if memorizing. Years later, she would say, measured and unsentimental, "We still loved each other. We just kept arriving when the other was leaving." Tony, reflecting in his own way, once admitted that he felt proud of her brilliance and displaced by it at the same time. An emotion he did not resent, but could not entirely master. Love remained. Synchrony did not. By 1967, after 8 years of marriage, they divorced. Nothing dramatic shattered. Instead, something essential thinned past repair. Papers were signed, schedules redrawn, rooms rearranged to fit fewer footsteps. One evening, after Emma was asleep, they stood in the same kitchen they had once filled with possibility and understood, without accusation, that devotion alone would not reverse the direction of their lives. "I kept asking myself where the fracture began," she would later confess. "Was it a choice? A role? A flight I should have refused?" The questions had no satisfying verdict. At 32, in a house rearranged for two, she fastened Emma's coat alone before school and then stepped beneath lights that demanded radiance without context. The audience saw triumph. They did not see the recalibration happening in private, a woman examining her own ambition with the same rigor she once applied to a score. Therapy followed not as indulgence, but as discipline. She did not seek permission to succeed. She sought coherence. Again and again, she confronted the same quiet truth. Excellence expands a life, but it also rearranges it. There were nights when applause still echoed in her body, while the house answered her key with earned silence. Costumes hung in order. Scripts lay open mid-scene. Emma asleep down the corridor. In that stillness, she recognized what had shifted, not love, not loyalty, but the structure holding them. Loving deeply, she would later reflect, does not guarantee staying. The pain did not embitter her, it refined her. The marriage ended. The tenderness did not. It changed shape, into vigilant motherhood, into boundaries learned at cost, into a steadier strength no longer dependent on perfection. The world continued applauding the ascent, rarely perceiving the interior reckoning beneath it. Two people who once believed art and love could rise without collision, discovering instead that the same force that lifts a life can also draw it quietly, irrevocably, apart. From then on, the applause followed her home only as after-sound. The house did not answer. The marriage ended without thunder, yet the silence it left was louder than any ovation. It compressed the air around her, stripping away spectacle, guiding her not toward a spotlight, but toward a narrow corridor outside a therapist's office in the late 1960s. Fame had given her applause. That hallway delivered truth. Just past 30, she was rebuilding herself piece by deliberate piece after a union that dissolved without ceremony. Blake Edwards stood in the ruins of his own collapse, worn thin by a marriage that had folded inward. They were too seasoned to romanticize damage, too clear-eyed to confuse intensity with destiny. And yet when they met, it was not fireworks, but recognition. Two brilliant spirits, each carrying fracture beneath the shine. Caution became shelter. Conversation became refuge. Their love was never ornamental. Blake battled chronic illness and long descents into depression, seasons when silence settled so heavily in their home it felt load-bearing. Julie, radiant before audiences, practiced a different art in private, endurance without applause. She became steadiness when his balance failed, warmth when the shadows lengthened. There were nights when the echo of applause still trembled in her bones while she stood in a dim kitchen, waiting for the darkness in him to loosen its hold. And still, they chose each other. 41 years, not spared from storm, but strengthened by surviving it. Film intertwined their purpose. Family gave it flesh. In the 1970s, they adopted 2 daughters from Vietnam, widening their world and their capacity to carry joy and weight in the same breath. Years later, she would say softly, almost astonished by the symmetry, "He steadied me, and I steadied him." It was never a fairy tale. It was a promise kept in ordinary hours. But even the deepest anchors surrender to the tide. In 2010, after more than 4 decades side by side, pneumonia overtook him. She was 75. She sat beside his hospital bed, her fingers threaded through his, speaking in fragments. Their children's laughter, the films wrestled into existence, the quiet mornings made sacred by his presence. She spoke as if memory could tether him, as if love, repeated often enough, could resist an ending. Machines breathed in measured rhythm beside them. Then the rhythm faltered, paused, flattened into a single merciless tone. In that thin sound, the world split cleanly into before and after. When she lost her singing voice in 1997, she called it a private extinction. This was something deeper. Not the loss of sound, but the loss of the one person who had heard every register of her, triumphant, frightened, exhausted, unguarded, and stayed. The house did not echo. It absorbed. The kitchen held its silence like sealed glass. No laughter turning a corner. No sentence completed without effort. Later, she searched for language large enough to contain the rupture and confessed, "I felt cut loose, like something once rooted had been torn free." It was not only grief. It was the shifting of foundations, the quiet collapse of an inner architecture she had trusted for decades. Those closest to her saw the change before she spoke it. She still rose each morning with the discipline forged by war, poverty, and the unforgiving stage. But her light had altered. Laughter came less easily. Beneath her composure lay a sorrow no spotlight could soften. She never named loneliness outright, yet it lingered in the spaces between her words. Sometimes her gaze drifted, not theatrically, but involuntarily, toward a memory too whole to dismantle. Asked what love meant in those later years, she answered simply, "It doesn't leave when someone does. It settles into you. It becomes part of your very bones." There was no performance in that truth, only lived proof. Blake Edwards' absence was the deepest farewell of her life. She had endured childhood fear, rejection, even the shattering loss of the voice that made her famous. None of it equaled losing the man who had seen every scar and did not turn away. And yet, she did not harden. She did not shrink love into liability. She carried it forward, quieter, deeper, less visible, but no less powerful. Her life was never the polished myth of an untouchable star. It was the testimony of a woman who understood that love can wound and chose it fully anyway, who accepted fracture without surrendering tenderness, who knew that admiration fills theaters, but life is decided in silent rooms. And in those rooms, in discipline, in memory, in the stubborn courage to rise again, she revealed something rarer than fame. Not perfection, not invincibility, but the strength to be marked by love completely and still stand each morning bearing its weight with unshaken grace. Nowadays, at the age of 90, Julie Andrews stands not only as a legendary figure, but as a woman whose lifetime of discipline and creative endurance has translated into cultural wealth and financial stability. Her estimated net worth is often cited at around $30 million, an industry estimate rather than an audited disclosure, yet it reflects something more enduring than currency: work that never stopped working. Film royalties continue their quiet circulation across continents. Residuals from television and stage surface decades after the curtain fell. More than 30 children's books, written in close collaboration with her daughter, return steady backlist income year after year. Her voice in Bridgerton carries her presence into a new era, proof that when one instrument is lost, another can sustain the melody. The number may be debated. The discipline behind it is not. Contracts signed before nostalgia inflated value. Decisions made without spectacle. Legacy managed without noise. In her case, money does not glitter. It settles. It accumulates. It waits, powerless against a house that grows quiet at dusk. Her real estate history reads like a map of ascent without excess. The townhouse on Chester Square in Belgravia, nearly 7,000 square feet rising across 6 floors, once embodied international acclaim. 6 bedrooms, reception rooms for private gatherings where influence moved quietly. A mirrored elevator gliding between levels. A private cinema, a wine cellar, terraces overlooking one of London's most coveted addresses. Beneath it, a spa level with gym, steam room, sauna, and whirlpool, luxury shaped more for shelter than display. A separate muse house and garage completed the contained world. In California, Malibu and Brentwood properties marked her Hollywood authority, multi-million-dollar transactions closing chapters like final scenes. In Switzerland, a chalet in Gstaad offered altitude and anonymity, snow softening the echo of applause. On Long Island, near Sag Harbor, family proximity replaced premier proximity. Each address charts a season: ascent, consolidation, retreat, return. The square footage measures success. The relocations measure solitude. There are no verified empires of excess, no parade of exotic cars, no curated museum of conquest. If she owns vehicles, they are functional, not performative. The architecture of her life suggests continuity, not applause. Rooms spacious, secure, and lit at sunset with more memory than conversation. Her days now orbit creative continuity rather than premieres. After the irreversible loss of her singing voice following throat surgery in the late 1990s, a rupture that could have ended her public life, she did not retreat into nostalgia. Instead, she reoriented. Writing became voice. Narration became presence. The Emmy-recognized performance as Lady Whistledown in Bridgerton demonstrates that authority does not require volume. In rare public appearances, she is silver-haired, composed, and luminously restrained. There are no public reports of grave health crises. At 90, she is described as mentally agile and thoughtfully engaged. She does not publicize dietary rituals or fitness regimens, yet the quiet evidence of longevity suggests discipline woven into routine, measured pace, intellectual labor, emotional economy. Family remains the axis around which this later life turns. Her partnership with Emma Watson Hamilton is not merely maternal, but creative, a collaboration that has yielded dozens of books and a shared literary identity. Her adopted daughters have largely remained outside the glare of celebrity, an intentional boundary that reveals something about how she understands protection. Since the passing of her husband, director Blake Edwards, in 2010, her life appears balanced between remembrance and forward motion, honoring what was built without fossilizing inside it. Details of her will and estate planning remain private, as they should. Philanthropic efforts have historically supported the arts and children's literacy, not as publicity gestures, but as extensions of what she has always valued: imagination and access. And this is where the story deepens. A life admired is rarely explained in headlines. It reveals itself in the silence after a lost voice, in the recalibration of identity when the gift that once defined you disappears, in the decision to begin again without spectacle or resentment. Her net worth may be counted in millions, her properties measured in square footage, her accolades archived in gold. But the truest ledger is written elsewhere. It is written in restraint, in the refusal to become extravagant simply because one can, in the choice to let dignity outshine display. If this life speaks to you, do not respond only with admiration. Reflect on what it means to endure beyond applause. Share not just what she achieved, but what she carried. Because the most compelling legacy is not a catalog of triumphs. It is the quiet evidence that even after admiration reshapes you, you can remain intact.